Yes, we can see the test. Thank you.
Test. Testing, captioning. Captioner, do you actually hear me speaking? Could you type something for the screen test? Excellent.
morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this special event. Now the meeting starts. I now have the honor to invite Chief Howard Thompson to lead the ceremonial call to order. Chief, please. His language.
Good morning. I'm going to do this opening address in my language. Ainakin nikali wessa so down siost na juni kori hote na kanune anta wata kata lolake te tuwa no halatu te na kia tito wakela te na ke kyokwa te itino halatu te chi a segolo na takali te ka tuwa hodi keto te ne nuni salate ni nuni salate ne te itino halatu te tuki na yohtun kwa ni gola ne noa te itino halatu te na yatini sta uhunjake chi sego hakweko ke kotkawa hake ne kaya te ke hatsala ne nuni salate ne ki nuni salate te itina walatu te tuki na yohtun kwa ni gola oni ki nuane te itina walatu te jin hauta ne lawana da ko sa kotkawa ne aunta ne da kaina wakonke ne ki seko agweko ni katake ne aunta kitko in kwa da kalite ke ne ki nuni salate te itina walatu te tuki na yohtun kwa ni gola ne nua ne te itina walatu ne China hota na kalohia kana kwati tiona tawalya. Loli huisu ji tekina da kalahko alake. Na dito wa kele te na chito wa chia kyo kene ka kalahko na chito wa no waladu. Ji seko lo tali hatum hake. Seko to swate to hake. Na amte na agute hialo na ta na uhko alake na kwati tiona tawa esto. Niki nuni salade ta chito no waladu na chito wa chia kyo kene ka kalahko tuki na yohtiona ngwa ni gola. Ne nua ne te itina walatu te ne ti sota asuntu ne ka kalahkwa. Ci seko tia dia na wako ne konunque ci nije ase ta hadi konsutuke ci ne kaina kain suta sutala. Ne oni te itina walatu ne ti sota asuntu ne ka kalahkwa. Ne ci seko ka nikula le ne ohne ka sua ci nije dia na tawole ne ka hunchaka no guadi. Tuki na yohti no guani gola. Niki nuni salate te itina walatu ne ojisto kwa sua. Ne to kalohia kan kwati tio na taole chikna hoti na deli humtinyo ne chitaun ge jitawa tawiste esu chikwa ni ko ha na kate ne kate ka hats la gena tkawa hake niki nuni salade te itina walade ne ajisto kwa suwa tuki na yohtun gwa ni gola oniki no ne te itina waladu ne sukwa tisa lo hatsala suwa ne kainyo kwetake ne te sakotinye tani ne ayo kinyata China kaina ko hunchaka no kwati na amdu skana ai to no tanyaka ne oni ne wasako na hihase ne hadili wayanto ne lawana sua ne amdu skana ai to no tanyaka ne akwe ko to kala kene kana wala duntsala tan chini kaliwas ne wa hodio te ne wa ho kena waste ne chito wa goana skanya dalio ne oni hali wayanto ne yuko wana sua Niki nuni salada kwe ko seko ni katake niki nuni salada de tina waladu de tuki na yohtion kwa ni gola Onigi nuni salade dan chito an holado na jina gaina lo wana taam sukwa tiso. Dan chito an holado jakana ka te todoktani no te sakotkawa na ka hunchaka no kwati na ta kaina wakonke. Nigi oni na dan chito an holado ci seko ni katakes na lo wana sua. Na amde na ta chito an holado jina hote na ka lo sakotkawa. Nigi nuni salade dan chito an holado na jina gaina lo wana taam tuki na yohtun kwa Nicola. Onkin nähty kytkö tätä ten huolatu ne tatuon ni selake jahtin kwa teantale ne katke näs ikwa tokta se nata ne ikwaja ne geoli on tatuon ni selake tätä on huolatu tuki na johtiin kwa ne gola thank you
From the Mohawk Nation, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, United States of America, for the traditional welcome to the 2019 commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Your Honorable Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Secretary General, Madam Amina Mohammed, Your Honorable President of the 73rd Session of the General Assembly, Madame Maria Fernandez Espinosa Garces, Mr. Brian King, Rapporteur of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, Excellencies, representatives of member states, Indigenous peoples, UN system, and civil society. Welcome to this celebration of the 2019 International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. As the Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations and a senior official of the United Nations system to coordinate the follow-up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, I'm honored to moderate the high-level segment of the observance of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Today is a special celebration. This year is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This event is organized by the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues in my department. For those of you who cannot join us in person today, this event is webcast for you to join us virtually and share with your networks. I also invite you to use the official hashtag Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as We Are Indigenous. I now have the honor to invite Madame Amina Mohammed, the Honorable Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to deliver her remarks for the commemoration of this day. Deputy Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, USG Lou. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone, and I wanted to stand here rather than there because I quite like to be next to this poster. This really demonstrates for us a message to everyone on this very special day that we still are very much a center of what will work for our 2030 agenda. Pleased to welcome everyone to this celebration of the International Day of the World Indigenous People. Let me say in the voices of my people, barka da zuwa. Muna murnan ganin ku daga bisa wannan labaran da zamu yi, muna kuma fatan al'adarmu zamu yi mu samu mu yi mu gama lafiya. And what I'm saying is welcoming you, but also praying that we will have a spirit of friendship and of respect for our many indigenous inheritances of our culture and of our way of life. Today is an opportunity to acknowledge the diversity and the wealth of knowledge of indigenous people that we possess and to recognize the richness that they bring to humankind. There are estimated 370 million indigenous people in the world today, and they're making their voices heard on many, many fronts. Indigenous women and men are advocating for sustainable livelihoods from one generation to another. They are defending biodiversity and the integrity of ecosystems and raising the alarm over the growing impacts of climate disruption. In the lead up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, indigenous people spoke about Mother Earth, a concept that encapsulates the wisdom and that humankind has neglected and that is now featured in the Paris Agreement as an equivalent to climate justice. Together, indigenous people are mobilizing to defend their way of life, cultures, languages, which are often rooted in harmony with the natural world. This year marks the International Year of Indigenous Languages, declared by the United Nations General Assembly to draw attention to the urgent need to preserve, revitalize, and promote our indigenous languages. Almost half the world's estimated 6,700 languages are in danger of disappearing. Many of those belong to indigenous people. With every language that disappears, a world loses a wealth of traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. Education will have a pivotal role to play in ensuring that indigenous people can enjoy and preserve their culture and identity. Intercultural and multilingual education will be necessary to prevent the irreparable loss. Failure to provide multilingual and intercultural education puts indigenous people at a disadvantage, threatening their very survival. This year, under the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, we looked at how we are advancing towards the achievement of the SDGs. In particular, we looked at the progress around the following 6 goals. Sustainable Development Goal 4, which emphasizes the importance of relevant, equitable, and inclusive education. SDG 8 on sustainable and inclusive growth and employment. SDG 10 calling for reduced inequalities, and SDG 13, underscoring the urgent action needed to combat climate change and its impacts. SDG 16, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice and accountable institutions. And then, as always, SDG 17, which seeks to strengthen our means of implementation and the partnerships and collaborations that are needed to sustain it. These goals are closely linked to today's observance of the International Day of Indigenous People. On this International Day, we must remember and highlight that Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world still do not enjoy their very basic rights. They endure systemic discrimination and exclusion, which threatens their way of life, cultures, and identities. Such barriers are compounded for Indigenous women and girls who also face gender-based violence and discrimination. The promise of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind and really to reach the furthest behind first. We must make every effort to enable Indigenous people to enjoy their full rights as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Taken together, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the outcome document of the 2014 World Conference on Indigenous People, and the 2030 Agenda form the frameworks and tools required to close the gap between our words and actions. Some member states are taking steps to revitalize and strengthen Indigenous languages. We are encouraged by these efforts and call on other countries to do so in close cooperation with Indigenous people. We must do more for the languages to flourish so we may retain the wealth and knowledge and cultures that are part of this world's rich diversity. That is our strength and not our weakness. I count on the political will of member states to support Indigenous peoples in determining their own development through policies that are inclusive, equitable, and accessible. Indigenous people must be engaged in every step of the process, from conceptualizing the idea all the way through to implementing it. The UN stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at realizing the rights and aspirations of Indigenous people, including through its system-wide action plan on the rights of Indigenous people. On this International Day, let us reaffirm our commitment to work together to realize those rights of Indigenous people sooner rather than later. And as the IPCC report comes out today and focuses on land degradation, it is really important to re-emphasize that we will and cannot stand for those who are human rights defenders of our environments, of our habitat, that are persecuted. And really we should put a stop to that, a zero tolerance for it. And I think on this day, really remember those who have gone down fighting for the rights of Indigenous people and their habitat. I thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, for your remarks. We're delighted to have you with us today, and thank you for reminding us that we must do more for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous languages to flourish and retain the wealth of knowledge, cultures, livelihoods, and practice that are part of world's biodiversity. Equally important, thank you for reaffirming the United Nations commitment to work together to realize the rights of the Indigenous peoples as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to ensure that no one will be left behind in achievement of the 2030 Agenda. Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. I now invite Mr. Brian Keane, Rapporteur of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, to deliver his remarks.
Thank you. Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Luiz Min, Undersecretary General of Economic and Social Affairs, Chief Thompson, Indigenous brothers and sisters, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor to be here today to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples with the theme of Indigenous Languages. On behalf of the members of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, I would like to thank the General Assembly for proclaiming 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This has brought significant attention to the urgent need to promote, revitalize, and strengthen Indigenous languages. There are between 6,000 and 7,000 oral languages in the world today, and it's estimated that approximately half of them will become extinct by the year 2100. Most of these will be Indigenous languages. More than 50% of the world's Indigenous peoples are in danger of losing their languages. The data clearly shows that this devastating trend is occurring all over the world. In Latin America, UNICEF estimates that 1/5 of the indigenous communities no longer speak their languages. 1/4, 24% of languages in that region are in danger of disappearing. In the United States of America, only 4 Yuchi-speaking elders remain, all over 90 years old. For the Tuao San people in Zimbabwe, which have a population of about 2,500, only a dozen elders between the ages of 65 and 95 speak and understand their language. These are only a few examples. Unfortunately, there are many, many more. If this trend is allowed to continue, the children and grandchildren of the majority of this generation of Indigenous peoples will not speak their mother tongues. This is among the most critical issues that Indigenous peoples face today, as it is language that allows Indigenous peoples to express their histories and traditions and to transmit their knowledge to future generations. The loss of Indigenous languages is exacerbated by ongoing conflicts over natural resources, destruction of Indigenous peoples' livelihoods, and forced relocation from their ancestral territories. This is intensified by assimilationist policies, where Indigenous peoples are required to adopt the cultures and languages of the dominant population. The lack of legal recognition of Indigenous languages often results in prejudicial treatment and disadvantages for Indigenous peoples, in particular in the areas of health, education, and access to services. More often than not, Indigenous languages are not taught in schools. In fact, today, some countries still forcibly remove Indigenous children from their families and send them to boarding schools, where not only are they forbidden from speaking their languages, but also often suffer mental, physical, and even sexual abuse. This is unconscionable. We know from the history of boarding schools in the United States and Australia, we know from the work of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was headed by Chief Wilton Littlechild, and spent over 5 years gathering evidence and listening to the testimony of over 7,000 boarding school survivors, that the sole purpose of these institutions is to destroy the cultural identities of Indigenous children. We can and we must do better than this. Indigenous languages cannot be revitalized in a vacuum. Protection of Indigenous languages requires protection of Indigenous people's lands, territories, and resources. It requires recognition of all of their rights as laid out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Cultural and language rights are indivisible from all of the other rights of Indigenous peoples and are critical to the implementation of the Declaration, as committed to by member states at the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples in 2014. Central to all of these rights and key to the protection of Indigenous languages is Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, which includes their right to freely pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development, to self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, and their right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, as stated in Articles 3, 4, and 5 of the Declaration. Further, to preserve and revitalize their languages, Indigenous peoples must be able to establish and control their own educational systems and institutions, and have access to education in their own languages, as stated in Articles 13 and 14. Indigenous languages have been developed over millennia and are inextricably linked to the lands, waters, territories, and resources of the peoples that speak them. Each language represents a unique framework for understanding the world in all of its intricacies, and represents a complex system of knowledge that is vital for sustaining the Earth's biological diversity, for finding effective responses to the challenges presented by global climate change, for maintaining the ecological integrity of the world's remaining intact ecosystems, and for ensuring long-term global food and health security. Each time a language dies, so too does a wealth of unique ecological, economic, pharmacological, cultural, and spiritual knowledge. The consequences affect all of us. As the great Marcos Terena, an indigenous Xane man from Brazil, said when speaking at the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, the future of indigenous peoples is the future of all humanity. So we cannot be complacent. We must all acknowledge that much more needs to be done. We must accelerate our efforts towards the full and effective implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In closing, I reiterate the call of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to proclaim a decade on indigenous languages. We are joined in this call by the other indigenous-specific UN mechanisms, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. Looking forward to the future, I urge you all to be bold, to invest in inclusive, rights-based approaches to sustainable development that go far beyond 2030, and to work with indigenous peoples as partners in creating a world that is just and sustainable, where the rights of indigenous peoples are both recognized and respected, and where their communities and their languages thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, for sharing the concerns and aspirations of indigenous peoples and the call for a decade devoted to indigenous languages. You very well elaborated, despite ongoing initiatives to preserve indigenous languages, the urgency to protect, develop, and promote them remains very high. Recalling what you said, it is important to look towards technological to retain their languages and use them in their daily lives. Only then can we ensure their continuation. Dear colleagues, I now have the honor to invite the audience to listen to a video message from Mrs. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Gassis, President of the 73rd session of the United Nations General Assembly. We'll play a video. Colleagues, I'm sorry to say that we have some difficulty in listening to the video, so we'll move to next. Dear colleagues, I think thank you for coming for this event. The indigenous cultures enrich the world's cultural diversity. Therefore, there is an urgent need to redouble our efforts to promote and protect indigenous languages for future generations. So we encourage member states to continue to do so by recognizing indigenous languages and supporting their inclusion in the educational system so that indigenous children can learn in their mother tongues. Mother tongue instruction facilitates learning and can preserve and protect indigenous languages for future generations. We hope that this day will raise attention to the need to revitalize indigenous languages as a part of the rich diversity of the world, and that it will also catalyze all stakeholders to accelerate action to develop and protect indigenous languages around the world. So let us implement United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples to achieve the objectives of the 2030 Agenda. Member states, indigenous peoples, and the United Nations, we can do it if we all work together. Dear colleagues, I wish to thank the Deputy Secretary General, the Chairperson of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples Issues, and other members of the Bureau for the Indigenous Forum, especially the rapporteur for coming to the event, and the President of the 73rd session of the General Assembly. No, we were not able to listen to her message due to some technical difficulties, and also especially the Chief Howard Thompson for their participation today. Deputy Secretary will leave us due to her other commitments, so please remain seated. We should have a pause to allow Deputy Secretary to leave the room.
Thank you.
Dear colleagues, we have hereby concluded the high-level segment of today's observance. I thank all of you for being here with us today to commemorate this important day. So please remain seated as the high-level speakers leave the podium, and the panel on the International Year of Indigenous Languages will follow. So please remain seated until the panel will start. Thank you. This one doesn't work. They need to remind the DGCM that there's a problem. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you.
You're going to be sitting here. So wait a minute. Wait, we will call you. Good morning to all of you. And as they say in my language, Juju, and a very warm welcome. We will now continue with this discussion, and first of all, I would like to invite Ms. Daniela Bass, who is the Director for the Division for Inclusive Social Development at the United Nations Department for Economic and Social Affairs, and the director our dear director that we also have the honor of working with as the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch and Secretariat of the Forum where I work, and all our colleagues that are organizing the event. We are within the Division of Inclusive Social Development. So, Ms. Bass, we'd just like to ask you to give a few remarks as the Director of the Division, and Ms. Bass, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Good morning. I have the floor, and now I also have the glasses. Thank you. Happy day to everyone. And, well, since most of us so far have spoken in their own language, allow me to say a few words. I belong to a minority group. It's called Friulani, from northeast of Italy. We have a language which is also recognized by the Italian government as an official language. So I would like to say a few words in my language as well. And I would like to start by saying, bundi aduch. Vuatris, que estéis aquí, y aquei que fevelin también le lengue furlane. Vue, ale un di important, y vue celebrin lis lenguis dal mond. I just said that I thank you all, particularly those who speak Friulano around the world, very few left. This language is less and less taught, unfortunately, and also in schools, although now there is an attempt to bring it back to school, there aren't too many teachers who can teach this quite complex language, I have to say. The Division for Inclusive Social Development, and I thank Chandra for having explained that the branch dealing with indigenous issues that also serves as secretariat to the Permanent Forum, I'm very glad and proud to have that branch in the division I lead within DESA. And the work of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, most of you are familiar with it, and we know that it provides a support to indigenous issues, and it really promotes an inclusive and holistic approach to development. So it fits beautifully in a division that promotes inclusion. And it is my honor here today to commemorate this day with you all, particularly when it comes to celebrating what the United Nations is doing, thanks also to the presence of indigenous peoples that are so much engaged in all activities related to implement and accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its 17 goals. Our Deputy Secretary General listed some of those, but actually, if we think of that, each of us is somehow carrying around the 17 goals in our lives. Me, for instance, at the age of 6, I got my disability, but my parents wanted to empower me. I went to school, SDG 4, because they wanted to make sure that I would have been included in all activities of the society, so overcoming inequalities, SDG 10, so also to have a proper education and speak various languages, so to avoid the vicious cycle of poverty, SDG 1, and it goes on. And indigenous peoples are so powerful in this. In their languages, all these different values, the different goals can be translated into actions, because a language is a culture, and a culture is the way we act. And therefore, I believe that celebrating this day is really, really creating the framework for understanding the world through the languages we speak. They represent our culture. They say who we are. They carry in their grammar or in their sounds centuries of valuable knowledge. And therefore, languages are at the very center of the efforts for empowerment, for equality, for inclusion. And this is especially true for indigenous peoples. Without recognition of and support for the preservation of your languages, our languages, their languages, the rights and freedoms of indigenous peoples are endangered or even lost. So what does this mean in practical terms? For many indigenous peoples, as you know, their history, culture, and spiritual values are reflected in the specific words, sounds, and concepts that are unique to that language. So if we can't communicate in our own language, how can we transmit to future generations the knowledge that I mentioned earlier on? But today, besides saying what is missing, I really hope that throughout the day we celebrate what we already achieved, what good practices are in place that revitalize and preserve indigenous languages and cultures. Yes, we are going to lose, unfortunately, more than 2,800 distinct, cultures And this is true. But we also have to see in what's happening of positive. If we think positive, if we feel positive, the energy goes out and brings more positivity. We take positive actions, we change our mental behavior, and we change our mindset. So let's see what's happening that is actually bringing us to where we want to be. Preserving the languages, preserving the cultures, preserving the worth and invaluable knowledge of indigenous peoples and their variety of communities. So the Division for Inclusive Social Development is really, really fully involved in this. Because you see, the department, DESA, through the division in this case, is the focal point for the whole UN on youth issues, the whole UN system. Aging, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, families. And it works on issues such as eradication of poverty, reducing social inequalities. By the way, we also have in our portfolio sport for peace and development, so I'm thinking of the indigenous games. And also those are reflections of our culture. And there we do have to speak also our languages. So let's keep in mind the variety of the work we do, and let's bring your languages there with your cultures for all the people I mentioned, because this adds value to the world, and this also languages, preserving the languages and revitalizing them where they are going to die. It means that we are really leaving nothing behind, and we are really accelerating the implementation of the SDGs, and above all, we do something that it is so dear to the United Nations. We keep promoting multilateralism and multicultures. This is the space to do that. So let's celebrate that. And again, in my language, Mandi Mandi. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Ms. Bass for explaining, and also I think it's wonderful that you also speak in your own language. All of us have so many different languages that we speak. It's a multicultural, multilateralism at its best. We are now going to go back to listen to Her Excellency, the President of the General Assembly. I'm sorry that we had a bit of a glitch and we could not show it as we had planned. So please join me now to just listen to the President. She has a beautiful speech, and I hope that you will enjoy it as much as we did. Thank you. Can you start?
Yes. Excelencias, hermanas y
Excellencies, brothers and sisters of the indigenous peoples, ladies and gentlemen, as President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, I join you in the commemoration of the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. This year is special because it is also the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Indigenous peoples are the bearers of millenary knowledge systems. Their languages are a central part of those systems. These languages not only are a means of communication, they are also unique ways to see and understand the world. They are symbols of identity and belonging, vehicles of values to transmit culture and history, and connecting indigenous peoples with nature. Of the almost 7,000 languages of the world, over 4,000 are indigenous languages. All of them are vulnerable. Many of them are seriously endangered. Others are in critical condition, on the brink of extinction, and others, unfortunately, have already been lost forever, taking the wisdom of their peoples with them. Being aware of the importance of preserving the linguistic diversity that enriches all of humanity, the General Assembly has proclaimed 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. In this context, the United Nations, through UNESCO, along with states and indigenous peoples, have been working decisively to protect them and promote their use. Friends, on this special day, when we celebrate the contributions, accomplishments, and rights of Indigenous peoples from all over the world, we must reflect on the great challenges that they face: the loss of their lands, territories, and resources, racism and discrimination, cultural assimilation, poverty, and exclusion. Indigenous peoples are also amongst the most vulnerable populations for the consequences of climate change and forced migration. These threats to the indigenous peoples also endanger their languages and with it the possibility to transmit their worldview and cultural heritage. Indigenous languages are priceless heritage and a vehicle of ancestral knowledge about agriculture, biology, astronomy, medicine, and meteorology, just to mention a few examples. This knowledge is vital to reach the goals of the 2030 Agenda. We must therefore defend the rights of Indigenous peoples and respect their way of life. Their survival is closely linked to the survival of their languages. This international year in particular must be used to promote the linguistic rights of Indigenous peoples and to promote the participation of Indigenous peoples in creating the policies meant to preserve them and revitalize them. I invite all states to redouble their efforts to reach this goal. And of course, we must also focus on the development of Indigenous peoples by training teachers who can teach the languages, linguistic researchers, and strengthening intercultural bilingual education. To do so, we need, among other things, to create reading materials that compile tales, stories, and myths of Indigenous peoples. This is the only way in which we can guarantee transmitting them from one generation to the next, the key to prevent any Indigenous languages from being lost, because languages are alive as long as we speak them. I fraternally greet all the Indigenous peoples of the world on this very special day to commemorate their battles, accomplishments, and rights. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank the Office of the President of the General Assembly, who's here with us today. Thank you, sir, for facilitating this, and please thank Her Excellency on our behalf for the speech and also for her continuing and ongoing engagement and commitment to Indigenous people's rights. I'm sure that she will continue this as she carries them in her heart. Thank you very much to the Rapporteur of the Permanent Forum and to our Director. Thank you very much. We now move on to the next segment. And before we start that, I just wanted to give you a few housekeeping rules and organizations. I want to thank the NGO committee, which is on the rights of Indigenous peoples, for their support in facilitating the participation of one of the speakers to this event. So thank you very much. I know that some of you are there, but please do convey our sincere thanks and appreciation to the NGO committee. I also wanted to let you know that this event is webcast and that we will be collecting some questions and comments later on for the panelists, that you can send them in. There's a hashtag, it's hashtag Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as hashtag Indigenous Languages, as well as hashtag We Are Indigenous, which is the hashtag we've also used for the seating arrangements this morning. We are going to start up now with a panel discussion, and I'd just like to explain a little bit about the flow. We're going to have interventions, panelists who will speak, and these panelists are all experts, extremely knowledgeable and experienced on this issue. We will then open up for questions and comments, and I'm going to ask the audience to be very brief for that, and then go back to the panelists again for comments, and then have another round depending on how the time allows. So I'd like to invite our four panelists to join us here, and this is Mr. Grand Chief Edward John, who is from the Nation, Miss Sylvia Musea, who is a Yaku, Mr. Mathura Bikash Tripura, who is Tripura, and Mr. Luiz Henrique Lopez, who is an academic from a well-renowned academic from Peru. So please, if you will join us all here at the front. I'm going to give a few, two guiding questions that I asked the panelists to actually consider if they could when they were making their presentations. And this is the reason why we have invited them to come here. We want to pick their brains from the UN. These are all 4 of them, and we're going to have other experts also speaking later, panelists, but these are 4 experts that we have identified who can provide us with a very good introduction, overview, background, give some insight into what is happening, but also give us some suggestions and some guidance and recommendations as to what is coming next. So we picked up on 2 questions that we want you to keep in mind as you make your interventions. One is that, drawing from your experience as leaders and champions of Indigenous languages, what do you think can be done to make sure that Indigenous languages continue? The second, and this is where we from the UN, and of course with the academics, the member states, all of us, we need your guidance and your suggestion. Where and how can we push boundaries to explore where you think Indigenous languages need to be in the years to come? So having said that, these are the 2, like a framework for you to consider. We're going to start out. We're going to have the panelists speak, and we're asking them to do it for about 5 minutes, if they can, to make it short and sweet. You will have another opportunity later as the comments come in. And we would now start off first with Mr. Edward John. Grand Chief Edward John is a former member of and chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He was for 2 terms, in fact, 2011 to 2016, and he is still very much engaged. He is also part of the co-chair of the steering committee. He's the co-chair of the steering committee of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. He's also an elected leader on the First Nations Summit of Political Executive. So, Grand Chief, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Can you hear? Okay. The Jins na Chailia, Satlachin, Dai, Howard Thompson, today, CEO of Masi, Yadasni, and the Hun, Nebatena Dan, Tletewa, so Masi Cho and Yadasni. I wanted to thank, firstly, our brother, Chief Thompson from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for acknowledging who we are as peoples and our place and our relationships with everything on this planet that we live on and outside, and how important it is each day to remember that. So I want to thank you in my language. I wish to also thank all of the dignitaries who are here with us today for making the time to be here and to celebrate this annual occasion, as well as all of you who've taken the time to come here, and to our guests and friends in the World Wide Web. Good morning from New York. I would like to acknowledge my fellow panelists. On behalf of the Indigenous peoples and state members of UNESCO Steering Committee, I wish to thank you for the invitation to participate on this auspicious day, August 9th, which is celebrated every year to deal with Indigenous peoples. Today, the focus is on the languages of Indigenous peoples. I wish to thank Madam Undersecretary General, Madam Amina Mohammed, recognizing that there's a larger context facing Indigenous peoples, and that is the continued discrimination and exclusion of Indigenous peoples. While there is a focus today on Indigenous peoples' languages, we have to be aware of the much larger context that contributes to the continued loss of Indigenous peoples' languages. UNESCO has been mandated to roll out the year, and on January 28th convened a one-day event in Paris to officially launch the year. Thank you as well to the President of the General Assembly, Madam Maria Espinosa, for convening a one-day high-level plenary at the UN on February 1st. UNESCO has a responsibility to carry out functions during the 2019 International Year for Indigenous Languages, including working with Indigenous state parties to convene regional events as well as a global event. As well, I want to recognize and acknowledge the many recommendations from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and from the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I expect will lead to a very full outcome document for the 2019 year. And one of the major recommendations, as we've heard this morning, is around a decade for Indigenous languages, building on this 2019 year. Because of the gravity of the continued loss of Indigenous languages, there's a greater urgency in supporting and revitalizing efforts for all of our Indigenous languages. This year, much needed and welcome light has shone on Indigenous peoples and our languages on this matter, and that light cannot be dimmed at the end of this year. The call for a decade underscores that much more needs to be done. Indigenous peoples' languages are treasures of humanity and need protection and support. In this regard, the UN, UNESCO, member states, and the member states of UNESCO, Indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations need to continue vigorously to support and act on the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples, including all of our languages. In this regard, I welcome the comments today of the President of the General Assembly, Madam Maria Espinosa. The United Nations cannot be the hospice to dying Indigenous languages. Indigenous peoples and communities in every corner of the world, including my own, are struggling with the retention of our languages in the turbulent seas of major language groups. With a focus on developing and increasing fluency, small and successful steps are being taken by individuals, including individuals like my own son, families, communities. Increasingly, these measures are being supported at all levels. However, much more needs to be done. I fully expect that the 2019 outcome document being prepared under the guidance of UNESCO and its steering committee will help chart a constructive, focused, and productive pathway forward. If you wish to review and contribute to the development of the draft outcome document, you will be able to find it on UNESCO's International Year website. It is a good day to be Indigenous on August 9th. Thank you. Snachalya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Grand Chief. And as always, we've worked very closely with Grand Chief Ed John for the last 6 years plus as the Permanent Forum member, but also as he continues his work and his commitment, and just to celebrate and acknowledge that. Thank you very much, Grand Chief. We move now to Miss Sylvia Museya, and Sylvia is an Indigenous Iaku Indigenous teacher. She's also a lawyer by profession. She's from the Mukogodo Forest community in Kenya. But she is currently also a legislator at the Nairobi City Assembly and the chairperson of the Indigenous Peoples National Steering Committee on Climate Change. So very accomplished, committed, engaged, and dedicated young woman. Please, ma'am, we'd like to hear from you today.
Thank you. So I will go straight to the point. Let me start by saying thank you to everybody in the room, the organizers, those who invited us, the people who are listening, and the people who shall implement our recommendations going forward. So I'll be very brief. I am a Yaku woman, and I am here to make a confession that I cannot speak the Yaku language. I speak an indigenous language that the Yaku have been assimilated to by another indigenous community. So within Mukogodo Forest, there is the Yaku people, but then there is the Laikipia Maasai. Maasai tribe is what most people can see I'm wearing. And that is the language I speak, Maasai. And even the Maasai language I am speaking, I've actually learned it over the last 5 years by a lot of effort. So I will say a few challenges indigenous languages is facing in the 21st century, especially in cosmopolitan cities like, for instance, New York, but mostly Nairobi and other towns where we come from. And then I look at what we're doing. So one, we have a problem of assimilation, assumption, and extinction of language. Because when we say assimilation is the larger communities, because we are doing trade, marriages, and things like that, are pulling the smaller communities and making them adopt either systematically or by default, adopt their language. And in the process, we are losing mostly indigenous language. We have a problem of migration. A lot of indigenous population is moving to the cities, either for jobs, for education, for a better life, and in the process, having children therein, and they do not teach their children the language, or they go to the nearest languages that are being spoken in the cities. But we also have a problem of prestige, where children, especially in the cities, think that it is cool to speak English and French and German, and to leave out their languages. We have a big problem of influx of foreign languages. In Nairobi, with all due respect to the Chinese in the house, a lot of Mandarin is being taught, and nobody is teaching indigenous language. But we also have a problem of commitment, that parents are just not committed anymore to teach their children indigenous language. We do not know why, and that is why an event like this today is very important. It reminds us that it is very important to speak our indigenous language. It's very important to identify with our culture and with our language. We had been asked what can be done. I thought one, legislation. And I will say that I'm a legislator in the assembly, and I came loaded with a notice of motion, and a motion that was passed on 7th of August, which is the day before I arrived here. And that motion compelled the county to allow childhood, primary children between 0 ages to 7 years, must have a lesson on language and culture at least once a week, at least. And that the county should provide resource materials, whether books, whether audiovisual material, so that children can be able to express. And the idea is that they go home and they are told tomorrow everybody is going to introduce themselves in their mother tongue. And the teacher is supposed, because we have a problem with cosmopolitan areas where so many languages are spoken in one city. So the children are supposed to come and say, my name is Sylvia, I come from Mukogodo, my mother's name is this, my father's name is this, my brother is called this, and things like that in their language, and she sits down, and the next child comes and does the same thing. So that is the motion that was passed. I have provided it, maybe shall be uploaded. Number two, we need a lot of documentation of indigenous languages and knowledge generally, because if we cannot teach what is not available. I have a 10-month-old son, and when I get bored of singing for him, I go to YouTube, and I type lullabies for 10 months. And there are so many. There is so much in English. And one of them that starts with Johnny Johnny, Yes Papa, has 2.5 billion views. And I cannot be able to find a lullaby in my mother tongue that I can press and say lullaby in whatever language so that my child can learn and can continuously listen to this. So we need a lot of documentation of the indigenous languages and even knowledge. We speak about that knowledge when you go to climate change, that we need a lot of documentation of traditional knowledge for us to either do climate change mitigation or adaptation or both. There's a requirement, I suggest that we do a lot of civic education for parents like myself, young parents, to understand the importance of indigenous knowledge. Because like I said, there is a bit of prestige attached to Russian and French and English and Chinese, and there is very little, or even these days children are victimized for speaking their mother tongue. It looks like backwardness. It looks like these children are a bit strange. Which language is this they're speaking? We need a lot of funding for the documentation of this issue, for documentation of language, for transmission of language. We need to give it an equivalent to climate change and biodiversity. So we need to push a little bit more for funders to understand that this is becoming a threat. And once we lose language, we lose culture. And once we lose culture, we lose a lot more traditional knowledge. And we're just starting to understand the importance of traditional knowledge in many other fields. I suggested building of cultural centers. Where I come from, there's a cultural center. And in that cultural center, on Fridays, women entertain in songs, young Morans sing, and the communities join in. So we have like a cultural day within the community setup. And it doesn't need to have infrastructure in terms of building. You just need to say that this is a cultural center. And on Friday, can we meet? And that is very easy to push agenda. It's like a chief's agenda, or it could be a government agenda, or it could be a community agenda. That on Fridays from 4 p.m., we meet at the cultural center, we sing songs, we do riddles, we listen to proverbs, and so on and so forth. And finally, I recommend for partnership between governments and indigenous peoples' organizations or community-based organizations, international agencies like the UN, on having more discussions. Because once there is discourse in the room, people start to understand this thing actually is important. And when I started the bill on teaching indigenous languages in Nairobi, for those who have been to Nairobi, Nairobi is a city as big, okay, not as big, but big like New York. And every community is there. There are 43 tribes in Kenya. And of course, the major 4 communities can be able to express themselves in their mother tongue. But the rest of the communities, because in the assembly where I serve as a parliamentarian, we are only 2 Maasais. Actually, these days I call myself a Maasai because people do not, actually Yaku is not a tribe yet recognized by the government. I'm pushing for that agenda right now, but it might take some time. So when people ask me, which tribe do you belong to? I say I belong to the Maasai because nobody knows who the Yaku are. And so when asked which language you speak, I speak Maasai. I would wish very much to speak Yaku as a person, but I do not know where to start. At some point, the French embassy in Kenya had done some intervention, and they had built 2 classrooms, and there were a few elders who are teaching small children after class. So after they finish school, they have lunch, and then they go to class and read. But we had a problem because there was only 1 dictionary. And when the teacher, by bad luck, passed away, we cannot be able to trace that 1 dictionary that was written by a professor from Rutgers University. So classes died. So we are waiting for the professor to tell us if they're going, we assume that's the professor who wrote the dictionary. We are hoping that he tells us where the dictionary can be found, and because we don't have any audiovisual material, and because the French embassy stopped funding, and it's something that the community can actually do without funding. They just need to be told it's important that your children. Those are my recommendations going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Very concrete suggestions, examples, and congratulations on passing the motion on the 7th of August, just one day before you started here. I think this also brings out how important it is that children learn their own language, their own mother tongue or father tongue. It's not necessarily that it should be, we shouldn't be gender biased here. So it should be mother tongue as well as father tongue. And this is sometimes a huge challenge. And when you brought in the issue of migration and people moving to cities, and for those of us who are international workers, for many of us here who are actually far away from their own communities, this is an added challenge, because whereas if you're back home, you have the community support in terms of the family, the bigger structure. When you're outside and abroad, you don't have that. So it makes much more of an effort. And I was just listening to what you were talking about with the teachers and the community centers. And it just shows how much there is in terms of community building and what we need to have from the communities, because that, I think, is actually where the work has to start. Once the community starts, then things will happen. And as with your community centers and your teachers, I'm sure you'll find a way. But thank you very much also for the recommendations you brought in. Talking of community centers and from the community level, we're going to move to Bangladesh, to Mr. Mathura Bikash Tripura. Just to explain, Tripura is one of the indigenous peoples that identify as indigenous in Bangladesh. Mr. Tripura is the executive director of an indigenous organization called Zabarang Kolyan Shamiti, which has been working for many years, and he's one of the leaders in that area. So, Mr. Tripura, you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me start with greetings in some indigenous languages that I know. Kulumka, Juju, Pringnam, Rikubaya, Gorlagi, and also the national language, Namaskar and Assalamu Alaikum. Good morning to everybody. Actually, our organization is working for the rights of education in indigenous languages for last about 1 decade. So I would just like to share the experience of our works in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, actually, we are about 45 indigenous people, indigenous groups. We speak about 5 different linguistic groups. So if we see about the policy or legal aspects of the position of our languages in Bangladesh, as per the Constitution of Bangladesh, actually there is only one single language called Bangla, because in the Constitution it is mentioned that the national language of Bangladesh will be Bangla. So the other languages actually are not that much recognized in the Constitution, but there are some contributing clauses, like in one clause, the Constitution is also recognizing the small ethnic groups of Bangladesh to create sort of opportunities for them to preserve and promote their heritage and culture. So maybe we can use this clause to develop the languages of indigenous peoples. So there are also some other legal documents, like the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord between the indigenous people and the government was signed in 1997. In this accord, the education in mother tongue is recognized. And the primary education development programs, this program also recognized the needs of education in indigenous languages. And following that, actually, the national education policy was formed in 2010, and there were a list of activities on indigenous languages and education in that policy. So actually, my organization works on these issues. Like in 2006, we have started piloting education in mother tongue in actually three majority languages, indigenous languages: Chakma, Marma, and Tripura, my language. So in these three languages, We have started pre-primary and gradually up to grade 3. So we tried bringing the policymakers, the bureaucrats in education ministry to visit our schools and to sort of showcase the activities that indigenous languages can be used in the education system. And following that, actually, the government from 2010 started thinking about through the national education policy, and in 2012 up to 2016, there were a series of activities undertaken by the government. And from that, in 2016, we got that the government has started already the education, pre-primary education for the indigenous groups. They have started primarily with 5 languages, 5 major languages, 3 from our hill region and 2 from the plain regions. So we doing that, actually, we have mobilized the community-based organizations, the networks, national and regional networks, and also the non-governmental organizations, and sometimes the national and international NGOs, they are also involved in the process. So it is now the time for Bangladesh to think about the legal, especially the policy on language, because in Bangladesh there is no language policy. If the government can adopt language policy, then the indigenous languages can also be included in the national policy, so that the language development, revitalization, and education in mother tongue of indigenous peoples can also be included in the process. So our recommendations for the government is actually not only for government, maybe we have to work together with the government and the indigenous peoples together. Otherwise, it will not be able to. We will not be able to achieve the targets. So our recommendation is we need an institute for indigenous languages in the country, national institute, so that the government can take projects and programs to develop and revitalize especially the endangered languages. Here I want to mention that in Bangladesh, among the 45 languages, there are about 14 languages endangered. Among them, one language called Lara. It is spoken only by 315 people. And there are also many other languages like Koda, spoken by only 1,300 people. And there are also many other languages spoken by less than 2,000 people. So this type of languages, the endangered languages, can be should be developed and revitalized. So you may know that the Bangladesh government has established one international mother language institute to actually work on the languages of the world, actually all of the languages. But there is no specific activities for the indigenous people there. So we are demanding there every time so that we have one specific department or one cell for the indigenous people in the institute, and also which will be run by the indigenous scholars. So that was also one of the recommendations from our side. And there are also many other issues like the teachers training. The government still doesn't have any process for teachers training. So these are also, this is also very much a vital issue to, like the government has already published books for the grade 2, but still the teachers are not trained to deliver the classes. So my concluding remarks is like education in mother tongue of indigenous people, it doesn't only benefit the indigenous people, it benefits the whole country and even the world, because we believe that the language education in indigenous languages enables children to read and write in their mother tongue and other languages, as the education starts from their language and what they know best. So we believe that this also somehow contributes to the SDG, our Sustainable Development Goals. And also the early childhood education in mother tongue, it's only possible in mother tongue actually, early childhood activities. And well-trained and supported multilingual teachers also needed. And also like MTB MLE enables lifelong learning. The MLE or mother tongue based education helps to address gender inequality also. So this type of many issues are addressed by the languages of indigenous peoples. If we take care of this, the issues of indigenous languages, then many of the sustainable development goals can be addressed. So I would...
Thank you very much to Mr. Tripura, and it's for also providing the linkage between the community level and what can be done when you have the community and the government working together. And I think that's a very constructive and positive recommendation, which I'm sure can be followed up on in different countries around the world. I just also wanted to remind us all that Bangladesh was actually instrumental, and to recognize that, because I'm also from the Hill Tracts, to have 21st of February proclaimed as Mother Language Day. So congratulations on that, and I hope that this will also help stimulate greater initiatives and activities at the country level and around the world. We move now to Mr. Luiz Henrique Lopez. Mr. Lopez is a Peruvian sociolinguist and an educator, and he specializes in intercultural bilingual education. He's an expert on indigenous languages and bilingual education, and has been providing advice to UNESCO and other UN agencies in the Latin American region. He's advising now the Education and Life and Work program of the German Corporation in Guatemala, and also the president of the PROEIB, which is an Andean foundation in Bolivia. So a person of great experience, great knowledge, who's actually been able to put all this to use. We would be very, very much looking forward to listening to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to share a few ideas with you today. As has already been mentioned this morning, 25% of the 500 and over indigenous languages that are spoken in Latin America are at risk. And their severe situation is due to both internal and external factors. And I think we have to pay attention to these two things. Both are, to my mind, of political nature, and they have to be addressed politically too. On the one hand, one has to call everybody's attention to the interruption of intergenerational transmission and this use of indigenous languages that have become increasingly frequent in Latin America. So, as far as answering one of the questions that Chandra posed us, I would emphasize that from a Latin American point of view, one has to move from legislation, which is abundant but not applicable necessarily, to fostering community action and to develop the agency of indigenous speakers so that they assume responsibility over their languages too. So the idea of the cultural community centers that Sylvia talked about is also very relevant for Latin America, particularly to work at community level. Emphasis on language use has to be a mandate for the coming decades if we don't want languages to become dormant. On the other hand, there is a lot of work to be done with the mainstream. It is not advisable to work only with indigenous peoples, but we need to work also with the mainstream, stressing not only the value, the importance of indigenous languages, but also for them to become acquainted with indigenous languages and to learn, even if it is basic phrases and a few words for simple communication in indigenous languages. Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers have to become acquainted with indigenous languages if we want them to survive. So intercultural bilingual education policies cannot be restricted only for indigenous populations, but also for mainstream populations. Sylvia also mentioned, and Chandra also did, that that migration is a very important factor that one has to pay attention to. According to the last round of national population censuses in Latin America, over 50% of indigenous peoples now live in cities, not anymore in the rural areas. For example, in my country, in Peru, the last census took note that 67% of indigenous persons lived in cities and not anymore in rural areas. And national language policies are restricted to rural areas and are not extended to the urban urban areas where indigenous peoples now live. So attention has to be given to that too. And another lesson that we have learned in Latin America is that more work has to be done with the youth. If we want indigenous languages to survive, we have to work with young indigenous, with indigenous youngsters and speak through their codes and through their new languages that they are using. So, for example, in Latin America, there's a very interesting movement of rapping and hip-hopping in indigenous languages. So that's a new vehicle now to make the language indigenous visible in cities. There is a young Quechua man born in Lima. He's 20 or 22 years of age, who's very popular nationwide, and he raps in Quechua and in a bilingual mode also in Spanish, communicating the importance of the Quechua language of the Quechuan society. And he has managed to create a movement of youngsters that have decided to learn Quechua in order to sing like Liberato. Liberato is his name, right? So paying attention to the youth and to the ways of communicating and speaking and singing. And last but not least, I know that this afternoon Eddie is going to talk about it, but the use of social media and the internet are also a key element for recuperating indigenous languages in Latin America. So to sum it all up, I would say that we have to move from norm to use, from policy to action, and for devolving to the indigenous communities their agency to do with their languages whatever they want to do. Thank you, Chandra.
Thank you very much to Mr. Luiz Henrique Lopez. I just also wanted to remind us all that we have 3 gentlemen here who were instrumental in us actually having the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And just remind the 3 of you that you were with us, Mathura, Grand Chief Ed John, and Luiz Henrique, that you were with us at an expert group meeting we had organized some years back. And this was the expert group meeting that actually came up with the recommendation that there should be an International Year of Indigenous Languages, which was then picked up by the Permanent Forum, to thank Mr. Brian Keane as rapporteur, which was then also endorsed and supported by the General Assembly, so that they then proclaimed the International Year of Indigenous Languages. The same expert group meeting also asked for a decade, and I think that is the call that is going out now. So just to give you all to recognize that and to thank you all and for joining us here today, and of course wonderful to have Sylvia here with us. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the comments you made, and thank you for bringing up also the question of youth. Because when you look at youth, they are, I have a teenage daughter, and I'm constantly amazed at how fast she can type. Well, some of the language I don't understand what she types. They use a lot of acronyms, but how fast they can type and how fast they can move these messages around the world. And you look at the rappers, and we were also very lucky that at the Permanent Forum, I think at a couple of the cultural events, we had some of these young indigenous rappers come. Because you look at music, music unites everybody, and in a way it kind of transcends language to some extent. But if you can, through music, have them also listen to the words as well, that is excellent. I just wanted to let you know, do a little bit of PR, that during the lunch break we're going to have a karaoke session in the hall there, so that'll also be an opportunity for you to learn learn a Quechua, and I hope you will be joining us there as well. So moving on, that now we have these fascinating presentations, and I think all 4 of the speakers have given us a very comprehensive overview, but also highlighted some of the challenges and opportunities. And I think what you said, Luiz, in terms of saying that indigenous peoples themselves should be the agents of change, of transforming and using their own languages. And I think that is a major issue that we have to keep in mind as we go forward. Now, we're going to open up for questions and comments. First of all, I'd like to ask if you will direct the questions specifically to the presenters. And if you are going to make a statement or whatever, please keep it extremely brief. And so we will open up first. I have a request from, I am just looking to see if we have His Excellency in the room. We have a request from Ecuador. I don't see His Excellency there. Yes, Your Excellency, I could not find you. We have, the first speaker will be His Excellency Ambassador Gallegos de Ecuador. I just wanted to recognize that the ambassador is also, Ecuador is one of the co-chairs of the steering committee of the International Year of Indigenous Languages and has been instrumental also in having this resolution passed at the UN to have the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Microphone, please. Microphone, please.
Perdón.
Please excuse me. Thank you, Chandra. Ecuador supports the statement to be delivered by Mexico on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous People. We are pleased that the celebration of significant importance to all of us, the International Day of Indigenous Peoples of the world, gives us the opportunity to think about the difficulties and the progress made in achieving the goals established in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We welcome the fact that this high-level event is discussing Indigenous languages, bearing in mind that this year is the Year of Indigenous Languages, and Ecuador is one of the main promoters of the proclamation of this year, 2019, as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which has now become a reality. I wish to acknowledge the role of Diego Tituano, who designed this resolution for Ecuador and negotiated a consensus resolution for all members, which is a great achievement at this time of the crisis in multilateralism. I wish to indicate that it was unanimously adopted. Ecuador is a multicultural, multinational nation with many languages protected by our constitution, and our constitution goes beyond multiculturalism as an expression of a long-standing process of the incorporation of civil society actors and representatives of all levels of society. We have focused on introducing indigenous languages into the school curriculum. We have bilingual education in each indigenous language of Ecuador. It is indispensable to have a broad intercultural dialogue in order to build alternatives. This is a central focus for cooperation and solidarity between states and indigenous peoples. Achieving this goal both nationally and internationally will be possible with the participation of representative leaders of indigenous peoples and nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot conclude without mentioning that this is an effort to make our societies inclusive. We must break down the barriers that separate us and integrate everybody, people with disabilities, indigenous migrants and refugees. Nobody must be left behind in our effort to have an equal world which is also fair and diverse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and we hope we can count on Ecuador's support as we move forward on this, and looking forward very much to continuing the collaboration and the commitment. We move now to the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. We have a statement from the Group of Friends. This is a group of about 14 or 15 different countries. 14, so please speak.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples, an interregional group of 20 states, including Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Bolivia, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, Estonia, Finland, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Norway, New Zealand, Spain, Paraguay, Peru, and my own country, Mexico.
To take part in today's event on occasion of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. This day is for the estimated 370 million indigenous peoples around the world. We are very excited to gather today to celebrate the world's 4,000 plus indigenous languages. Each indigenous language represents a unique framework for understanding the world in all its complexity, and each is a repository of traditional knowledge. However, as we observe the day, we also come with a sense of urgency. The cold fact is incontrovertible. indigenous languages across the world continue to disappear at alarming rates. With the loss of a language comes the loss of a distinct forms of expression and unique ways of knowing and experiencing the world. Consequently, the disappearance of a language implies a huge negative impact on the indigenous culture concern, as well as on global cultural diversity. Linguistic diversity is indeed a form of human wealth and a key instrument to realizing sustainable development, good governance, peace, and reconciliation. This International Day is an opportunity to continue to raise awareness of the critical need to revitalize, preserve, and promote indigenous languages. 2019, proclaimed as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, has seen important efforts in this regard. We commend the important work carried out by UNESCO as the lead agency for the organization of the International Year, as well as the work of the steering committee. Yet, much still remains to be done, and sustained efforts beyond 2019 must be made to address the challenge. The adoption of a human rights and fundamental freedoms-based approach, coupled with the exchange of experiences and best practices, the use of information and communication technologies, and the implementation of innovative approaches are crucial to revitalize, use, and develop indigenous languages. Ultimately, they are critical elements to help ensure the transmission of indigenous language to future generations. President, the challenge is truly big. However, it can be achieved if we work together among member states with indigenous peoples, representatives and institutions, civil society, academia, and international and regional organizations. As we celebrate this International Day, we renew our commitment to the protection and revitalization of indigenous languages. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the group of friends. As you know, we count on them constantly while we're here at the UN for any support or any encouragement. So please, thank you to all the members very much for your support, your commitment, and your openness and flexibility in moving this issue forward at the United Nations and beyond. We have now we have quite a few requests, and I'm going to see if I can alternate a little bit between different groups, so you have different viewpoints. We are going to move now to I'm sorry, some of you, I don't know who the names, so I'll just point to you, so please do excuse me when I do that. We will now move to El Salvador. We have a request from El Salvador to speak. Please go ahead, sir.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I would like to begin by thanking the different panelists for their participation and their excellent contributions. This is a very important topic both for my country and our region, and without any doubt for many other regions in the world. We also wish to refer to the importance that we give, as one of the panelists mentioned, to the future establishment of a decade of indigenous languages. We know that this is something that can bring this important matter to international attention, and my country is prepared to support this initiative. El Salvador also wishes to support the statement Mexico made on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. In my national capacity, I believe that when we commemorate the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, we should begin by recognizing that indigenous peoples have all the internationally recognized human rights without any discrimination, and that indigenous peoples have collective rights for their well-being and comprehensive development as established in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is therefore indispensable for states to watch over the rights of indigenous peoples to preserve, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their own stories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, knowledge systems, writing and literature, and designate and keep the names that they choose for their communities, places, and individuals. In this vein, El Salvador is a pluriethnic and multicultural state established in the national constitution that native languages spoken in national territory are part of our national cultural heritage, which should be safeguarded by the state and subject to special laws for their presentation. Several initiatives have been promoted for a multicultural educational model in several parts of the country, as well as projects for the teaching and dissemination of the Nahuatl language. Nahuatl is a language which has been given the greatest attention because it has the largest number of speakers, and this is why the greatest number of initiatives for its dissemination have been developed. There are also initiatives to preserve the languages Potong and Pispi of the Lenca and other peoples, respectively. However, historic conditions have left their traces, and El Salvador has several public policy instruments for indigenous peoples. The National Plan for Indigenous Peoples, as well as the National Action Plan for Indigenous Languages of El Salvador, which takes the recommendations of paragraph 8 of the outcome document, including the learning of indigenous languages, which is essential. It is one of the actions being taken to change the syllabus in schools to include the mother tongue of each people, as well as their history, culture, and customs in coordination with the participation of the leaders of the indigenous leaders, as well as the native speakers of the various languages. We are drawing up joint actions with our indigenous peoples, which will make El Salvador give a greater value, respect, and appropriation and ownership of the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. Our peoples will be playing a fundamental role in our national policy development, and the National Action Plan for Indigenous Peoples is organizing various activities on Salvadoran territory in order to commemorate this International Day. Lastly, it is our hope that this International Year of Indigenous Languages will continue to be an enormous opportunity for states to build tools which leading to the revitalization of indigenous languages in each nation. We call on the United Nations system and cooperation agencies to support the execution of our indigenous peoples policy in El Salvador, both by providing technical support as well as constant monitoring, which will make it possible for us to effectively comply with the commitments of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the recommendations of the Permanent Forum. Thank you very much.
Gracias. And I also wanted to recognize that El Salvador is one of the first few countries that actually has a National Action Plan on the rights of indigenous people. So congratulations there. And we look forward to the great achievements you're going to bring with the National Action Plan. We move now to Norway. We have Her Excellency Mr. Eke, who's going to speak. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and shall I say happy birthday on your very special day. Thank you for organizing this very important and extremely interesting event. And as you just heard, we are also part of the group of friends, so muchas gracias, Mexico, for reading out the statement on behalf of all of us. Norway supports this International Year for Indigenous Languages by being a partner, and we encourage all states to register as partners. The Sami parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland cooperate on a project that aims to establish a common Sami language center. Sami Gelagaldu. I'm not very good at Sami, but I tried. The Norwegian government supports this initiative with permanent funding. Additionally, extra funding has been allocated to the Sami Parliament, Samedigi, to their work to follow up the language year. And the president of the Sami Parliament, Aili Keskitalo, she's a member of the steering committee of the Year of the Indigenous Languages. And despite legal equality in Norway, there are still challenges in practice to make the Sami languages on an equal footing as Norwegian. However, there is an increase in the use of Sami languages in public spaces, for instance, in social media. There are some tools in Norway that have been developed, and the Sami Parliament is very much interested in following this up. But there are some challenges, as we heard from Madam Sylvia, in terms of the international companies who run the social media. And the Norwegian government will contact these companies to see if it's possible to accommodate indigenous languages better. So, and I also wanted to end with a comment on the youth, and I was very happy that was mentioned. And you may even have heard in previous events rappers who rap in Sami. So it's also, you know, in Norway the same thing, and even maybe a very, you know, silly thing, popular culture thing for those of you who are addicted to something called the Eurovision Song Contest. Norway has, for quite a few occasions, had Sami singers and musicians represent us. So in a very small way, they have been part of Norwegian mainstream culture, but there's still a long way to go, and that is why this event is extremely important. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much. And I have to confess that I have Sami connections. So my husband actually is a Sami, so I have a half Sami child, and they were following the Eurovision and the Sami singer. So that's really, really something very spectacular. Thank you very much. But I think also that in terms of you following up with the companies and the social media, I think that's a very good, already you can put a tick, Luiz, Henrique, that there has been some leeway made. Speaking of youth, I know that there are quite a few young people here, and I see them sitting up there, so I'm going to give the floor to the youth, please. I don't know who among you would like to speak, to say a few words. I hope you can speak. Yes? Okay. You have the floor, so please introduce yourself.
I'm the delegate from the Wango, and I'm from China. So thanks for our speakers' presentations. I really appreciate that. Firstly, I strongly convinced that the government should engage in the protection process more in the future. And now I want to ask a question that the hashtag is playing a definitely very important role in the protecting process, but most native speakers, they usually live at the poor areas and they have a very low level of education. So they don't know how to use hashtag. So how can we deal with this difficult? And could our speakers offer us some information about the application of hashtag in the protection process? Thank you very much.
Okay, since we're there, thank you very much for that concrete question, and I'm sure the speakers will come. We'll move to, yes, Ms. Mini Degawan.
Thank you very much. I'm Mini Degawan from the Cordillera, Philippines, and I come here with 7 young indigenous peoples from the Cordillera who have grown up in the U.S. because their parents, by force of circumstance and by choice, have opted to come and live in the US. And this goes very much directly to what Sylvia has shared about out-migration and the challenge that it brings. I was also in an occasion with this youth where they danced and wore the traditional dresses, and they danced very beautifully. Unfortunately, none of them speak the language because, as Sylvia rightfully said, the challenge to the parents, the commitment to teach them. But there's another challenge. Our languages and our cultures is very much land-based. It is the culmination of our relationship with the land. And when you're in the US, that does not exist. So our youth are able to dance beautifully, but because they do not have that intrinsic relationship with the homeland, then the language loses its relevance. So this is a question I would like to ask the panelists. How do we address this? Because the reality is more and more Indigenous peoples need to get out of their territories by force of circumstance, by choice. They have to live elsewhere, and they bring their children with them. And much as we would like to teach them the language, because we are no longer connected to the root of that language, it becomes more difficult. So yes, we have the social media, we have YouTube, but then there is something lost. So how do we address that? And lastly, I would like to recommend to the Permanent Forum that maybe because the issue of language is an intergenerational issue, that it would be nice to have the youth present to also present their views on this issue. So thanks very much.
Panel and then thank you very much. And we do have some questions and comments to the panel. So I'm going to actually come back to the panel now for some comments or responses that may have. And then we will open up again for the second round. I have some names already for the second round, so please be patient. To the panel, Luiz, please, if you would like to start.
Okay. Thank you very much. It is true that the youth have lost, in many cases, attachment with the territory. But it is also true that languages evolve and languages can adapt to new and challenging situations. That is the case of using indigenous languages in urban settings. So long as you give the youth the possibility to use their languages, and you fight against racism and discrimination that impede or limit the use of indigenous languages in cities, believe me that the language itself will, and the speakers themselves will find the ways out to make their languages also relevant in urban settings. That has been the case of many indigenous languages in Latin America. Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and Nahuatl in Mexico are also being used in urban settings. And as I said before, youth are rapping in these languages. And to rap in those languages, you have to create new words. You have to find new means of making your languages useful in new settings.
Thank you. I will briefly say about language as a land-based issue and say that in my country, with all respect to people who understand, they're Indians, and then there are Somali people or people of Somali ancestry. And in my country, I don't know if it is that way in every country, every Indian child is able to speak Hindu, whether they are born in India or they're born in Kenya. And it doesn't even matter if they are born in Kenya in a village. For some reason, they're able to speak Hindu. And that is the same for Somalis. And I've seen that there are so many Somalis in the US, and they speak fluent Somali language. So there is a secret. And you understand that in my country, Indians and Somali run the business enterprise. So there must be, and it's a family-owned enterprise. For instance, Indians, it's a family. When I was a small child, where I bought my school uniform, that same person is selling my children the school uniform, only that now it is his son or his daughter. So there is an advantage that they have on language and maybe other things. But I have to say, in my country, the vernacular media industry is so huge now. It's a multi-million industry. Advertisements are done in mother tongue. And because there are 42 tribes, means there are 42 vernacular languages. And so there are like over 15 media industries specific to specific tribe. And those media industries, whether it is radio or TV, are getting more advertisement deals than the mainstream English and Kiswahili, the national languages in the constitution, which is English and Kiswahili. The vernacular media industry is overtaking the mainstream. And that is one way that we can grow mother tongue in the cities, in cosmopolitan cities. But again, we have to show that speaking mother tongue is now cool, or singing in your mother tongue is cool. Because for some reason, at some point, it became not so, it looked archaic to speak mother tongue, and looked like if your child is just 2 years or 3 years and they can speak fluent English, then they know that's a town baby and their mothers are rich and their fathers are educated. But we have to go back and tell them that it is not nice when you are an adult and you cannot speak in your mother tongue. So I think we just need to raise the profile of speaking mother tongue, that if your children come home, you cannot continue to address them in the same language that they speak in school. And that goes back to saying that we need more documentation, whether in dictionaries, whether in audiovisual materials, in some form, whether in YouTube, that we have to be able to produce songs and poems and things like that in mother tongue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your presentations. I would like to go back to the two questions that Chandra raised as part of the context. I'm from Western Canada, and the language that I speak is Dakil, and that language is also part of the Dene or Athabaskan language family, which is found in Alaska, in northern Canada, Northwest Territories, Yukon, the northern parts of most of the provinces. It is also spoken by the indigenous peoples in Southwest United States, the Navajo people, the Apache, the Yurok, the Hupa. In Northern California, many different tribes who speak that language. And it's shared widely in Canada. There are over 50 indigenous languages. In the province where I come from, British Columbia it's called, there are 30 indigenous languages from 8 major language families. And so there is a degree of complexity there, and every one of those languages are endangered. And that's the challenge that we have. The question was what to do for indigenous people's languages to continue. I want to use the word indigenous people's languages. There's a tendency to use the word indigenous languages, and I'll tell you why I said that. I was at the official launch in Paris, and there were large language families in the Middle East and in Europe who were actually claiming that their languages were indigenous, even though from where I sit, it seems to be a major language family. So I think there are important distinctions to be made, and here the indigenous people's languages kind of focuses the language or the focus on indigenous peoples, and our languages, not with all due respect to all languages, I think they're all important. The key that we've determined here at the Permanent Forum, when I was a member of that, as we listened to the experts and as we listen to the elders in our communities who are speakers, the key is fluency in the language, supported by literacy. There's been a lot of focus on literacy, developing dictionaries and books and other materials, and these books from the young people and the youth pick it up, and there are words in these dictionaries and they don't know how to pronounce those words. So there's a fluency aspect that needs to be determined. So the question was asked up there by that young man about how to use technology or high tech. We need their help to be able to use that technology with the elders to create a fluency database. And I think that's critically important. As well as in legislation in Canada, we have now federal law in place supporting Indigenous languages. It was just approved just over a month ago. And so we have now a legal foundation, but as our professor says here, language foundation is important, but actually the practice is important. And I think that's where it falls apart, is the practice standards to support the objectives in legislation or the objectives in policy. So I think that the practice standards starts in the family, with the community supporting fluency in the home and in the community, supported by the community to be able to do that. The challenge, as we've heard, in Latin America, of course it's true in Canada and the US, is the migration. And over 50% of our peoples now live in urban areas where there are no materials, there are no resources generally to support the continuity of our languages for those people who are living away from home. The second question is how to create and push languages, I guess, as I said, first in the community, but I think as we are doing in 2019, as we advocated, to create that interest by declaring 2019 as the International Year. But as we ramp up the interest and we understand the complexities of language loss and the complexities of language retention and rebuilding, then we need to build on this momentum that we create this year by ensuring that we have a decade to continue to build that momentum until we have greater and more solid foundations for the revitalization of Indigenous peoples' languages. You know, we heard from the former Secretary General that one language, Indigenous language, dies every 2 weeks. And that's why I made the comment that the United Nations simply can't be the hospice to dying languages. We need to have something that's concrete, actionable, practicable, and in practice helps our communities. In that regard, I do certainly welcome the UN member states for the continued support that they have to shine this light on this issue, and really welcome that the statement and the statement by the group of friends, really one that I really endorse, and one that I really welcome, that the group of friends are stepping up and helping. I'm asking and calling on all other member states of the UN General Assembly and the member states of UNESCO to take like measures to be able to support what we are trying to keep. These are treasures of humanity. They're not plastic to be thrown away into the junk pile of history. They need to be recognized as treasures and supported in that way. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I would just add one thing, especially the engagement of young people in the preservation and revitalization of the indigenous languages. It is very much important. And to do this, I think using the technology is very much important. Last May, UNESCO has arranged one hackathon on indigenous languages, where the technical people and the companies came together to find solutions for the preservation and revitalization of the indigenous languages. So I think the UN can continue this type of activities so that the languages of indigenous peoples, especially the endangered languages are documented and preserved and revitalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to, for the panelists' comments and insights, and we're going to move now to the second round of comments and inputs. We have Bolivia first. You, sir, have the floor. And just to say that Bolivia also has been extremely supportive in terms of the declaration and the resolution together with Ecuador. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Fraternal greetings, first of all, to all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world. Let me share an experience, a personal experience from my country with you. I come from a plurinational state which constitutionally recognizes 36 indigenous nations, their languages, their dialogues. The president is an indigenous person for the first time in history. 63% of the population identifies as indigenous, and revitalizing and conserving language for our country is possible. In Aymara, what this means is good morning, brothers and sisters, and long live the day. The preservation, conservation, revitalization, and promotion of indigenous languages is one of the prime aspects of state public policy in my country, Bolivia. In this vein, indigenous languages are not just a tool for communication, but through them our peoples and nations project their knowledge, their know-how, way of life, and social organization. This is how we understand our culture, transmit our worldview. Indigenous language is part of our very identity. As I said previously, around 6,300 indigenous languages are being spoken throughout the world, and 40% of them are in danger of extinction. Most of them are indigenous languages. This was said earlier, but when they are lost, we lose our identities as well. These languages are like windows that put the universe into words. The loss of a language is the loss of a world view. It impoverishes and shrinks human intelligence. Brothers and sisters, the year of indigenous languages is a specific way of giving value to the dimension of indigenous culture throughout the world. Language is the identity and culture. It also represents the code and the ideas of peoples. It is one of the greatest treasures our forebears have left us. We must recognize that with the effort of indigenous peoples themselves and the support of some states, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Inter-American Declaration of indigenous rights, as well as ILO, as ILO 169. It is evident that this progress is a result of the fight and resistance of our peoples and our nations. And in this vein, from the experience of Bolivia, we propose to reserve the knowledge and wisdom of our ancestors, the collective form of our organization of our peoples, because we are the heirs of great peoples who built civilizations with sophisticated knowledge. Let us preserve, revitalize, and promote existing indigenous languages in the world, which are the legacy of humanity. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We're going to move now to a different region, just to mix it all up a little bit. And we're going to have, there's a request from Idir, from the Amazigh community. You have the floor, sir.
شكرا.
Thank you.
بالنسبة لنا تحية الأمازيغية.
For us,
يعني في المناطق الأمازيغية. أنا هنا أمثل أمازيغ كوميونيتي أمريكا أو منظمة
I represent the Amazigh community America. I come from the north of Africa, and you know where it is. This is an Amazigh region, Amazighs who are in the north of Africa. This language is more than 4,000 years old. It existed before the pharaohs. There are archaeological sites where the traces of this language have been found in Burkina Faso and in Morocco, and also in Hogar in Algeria. That is why today transformations have taken place in my country, Morocco. Yes, my country, Morocco, in 2011 declared that Amazigh would be the second official language. The Arabs arrived more or less 1400 years ago. And so the Arabs came to the area, but they are now in power, and that is a big problem. We have a big problem in Morocco, which is that we are here to commemorate the International Day, the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and the Amazigh language is suffering today, even if there is a recognition of the status of the language. The Constitution does recognize this as an official language, but there is a problem. What is it that we want in Morocco? What do indigenous peoples want? We've listened to the speakers, but we would like to say the following. The indigenous language, the Amazigh language, must be included in school programs, in school curricula, but we nevertheless are seeing some backsliding on that front because this language is not always available as a language of instruction in schools. There aren't enough teachers in schools, and sometimes teachers are appointed, but they don't have the requisite experience to teach that language. The teachers really need to master this language. My mother is Amazigh. My name is Idir, which is an Amazigh name, and they decided to use that name, but at a certain point, those names were no longer able to be registered as official names. But recently, and following this constitutional reform that I mentioned, some names can now be officially adopted. But as I said, there is nevertheless backsliding taking place in education, and the documentation of this language is not what we would want. That is to say that artists and intellectuals, those who express themselves through the medium of the Amazigh language, dance, theatre, music, and so on, they express themselves through the language. And so now, as I'm speaking, even today, in Agadir, a region which has an Amazigh name, a ceremony is being organized, which unfortunately is something that Amazigh artists have been excluded from. It's only international artists that are allowed to participate. And so today the Amazigh language is being excluded in Agadir in Morocco. How can that be explained? The Amazigh language is used on street signs in the past, but that's no longer the case. We can see all of these political trends. But how do we address the indigenous, how can it be that indigenous languages and indigenous peoples are being treated in this way? Why do people want to change the future of the Amazigh people? We speak the language in all aspects of our lives. Now, an Islamist party has brought a document to the Moroccan parliament to discuss this subject, namely adopting a language other than Amazigh, that is to say, not using our alphabet, but using a different alphabet. There needs to be diversity, and the Amazigh language, which has existed for more than 4,000 years, must be preserved. But how can we do that if there are people who are resisting and fighting against us? You spoke about exclusion and racism and so on. The UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Special Rapporteur against Racism said that the Amazigh people faces exclusion and other forms of discrimination in Morocco, which means that the state has put in place discriminatory laws. More than 100, the former Secretary General, who's the Prime Minister in my country, accepted this legislation, meaning that Amazigh land was taken into public ownership to be used by the states of the Gulf. That is to say, the petrodollar states. So they are exploiting our lands.
Can you conclude?
نعم في الأخير أقول لكم تنميرتنون وهي
To conclude,
أمازيغية
thank you, Otammenua in Amazigh.
Thank you very much. And this, in fact, with this intervention, you could see that there are certain gaps and challenges that remain, yet there are also some positive developments, as for instance, the recognition of Amazigh as an official language. And I think this also provides an opportunity for other countries to also follow this example, because in many other countries around the world, I know that many of the indigenous languages are not recognized officially, but yet this provides an opportunity, an entry point, and I'd like to take it from there. We will now move on, and the next speaker I have is from Peru. You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, señora moderadora.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. We wish to welcome and thank the panelists for the valuable information conveyed. We support the statement of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples read out by Mexico, for which we are grateful. Peru joins the celebration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and welcomes the important topic chosen for this year, Indigenous Languages, in accordance with the declaration of 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, which draws attention to the loss of Indigenous languages and the pressing need to conserve, revitalize, promote, and adopt urgent national and international measures to preserve them. Language is a fundamental for people who speak it. It symbolizes thousands of years of human development, and it is a way of seeing and perceiving everything that surrounds us and how we think. It is a centerpiece of human existence. The death of a language is a serious, sad loss for all of humanity. With this in mind, Peru has many legal provisions that it is implementing, several programs and projects to revitalize our indigenous languages. In this way, the International Year of Indigenous Languages 2019 is a valuable opportunity and tool to promote the defense and use of indigenous languages and guarantee the rights of their speakers. It is also an opportunity to take actions, programs, and projects that will promote the recognition and promotion of linguistic and cultural diversity for humanity. Last January, Peru set up a multi-sectoral group to conduct this type of actions. Peru is going to be the headquarters of the next regional conference on indigenous languages, which will take place in Cusco from 26 to 27 September of this year. This Congress is one of the 6 regional events the UNESCO is planning on a worldwide basis, and to generate a constructive space for discussion on the protection, promotion, and revitalization of indigenous languages in our regions. Support, accessibility, and the promotion of indigenous languages are the 3 main focuses of discussion. We will have national and international participants, representatives of civil society, of indigenous peoples, of NGOs, the academic world, and various stakeholders of international organizations. Long live indigenous languages in Quechua. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you very much. And we move now to, I have Mr. Hipólito Arriaga Pote. You have the floor, sir.
Bueno, quiero hacer una...
I would like to make a statement, and I would like to thank the panelists. My name is Hipólito Arriaga Pote. I'm from Mexico. I represent the 30 million indigenous people and communities that exist in Mexico. As a representative of Tlatlani and the Mexica Emperor of Mexico. Let me tell you about my background. I wish to thank God for having given us the opportunity and the ability to arrive here with my brothers and sisters who've come from Mexico, as well as a sister who represents Mexico. It is a source of pride that all of the issues being discussed here are good. But I would like to go farther than that. I think that indigenous languages are disappearing. Throughout the world, with global warming, we have to come together to respond to this. If we, peoples of the world, do not work together with governments, indigenous people have to help protect our Mother Earth. But our Mother Earth is becoming tired. We want to help with everything. First of all, discrimination must be eliminated. International treaties and ILO Convention 169 must be respected. The 2030 Agenda for Development must be carried out. In this way, languages will not be lost. In this way, we will be able to recover what we have to do for our Mother Earth. I call on the United Nations and on UNESCO to provide resources to indigenous communities. In this way, we can help end discrimination and emigration. Our brothers and sisters have to leave the fields which are no longer producing anything. They have no economic resources. The children go off to the cities. And I think that together with the aforementioned authorities, we can work to changes, to change the world. Why not? We as indigenous people can help to prevent climate change. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I am here to express the presence of Mexico. Thank you.
The panel want to reply to this? Okay. Yes. We can do one more round and then we'll go for the final round. Yes. Did you have any comments, questions from the panel, Luiz?
Just a quick, voy a hacerlo ahora en español.
I'm going to do it in Spanish now. Just a quick reaction to some of the issues that have been brought up here, which have to do with those factors which are more external than internal that I referred to in my first statement. I think that we must focus on the things we heard this morning from the highest authorities of this House. The urgent need to look at languages from a comprehensive viewpoint and to deal with the extra linguistic factors that affect their continuity and their survival, as the brother from Mexico just brought up. From that point of view, linguistic and cultural rights of indigenous peoples are not separate from the historic claims on territory, on decent work, and for a decent life. So, it is concerning, quite concerning, in Latin America when we see the forced displacement of indigenous peoples because of the stress that is being put on extractive activities throughout the continent. So territories that were previously recognized as belonging to indigenous peoples are given out as concessions to the oil industry, the gas industry, to mining companies, and this affects the key to life, which is water, because water is being polluted. I just wanted to go back to what a Mexican activist and repeats over and over again. This Ayuk woman says languages don't just die of their own accord. They're not dying, they are being killed. Languages are being killed. And let's not forget that there is no language without speakers. So we're not just talking about revitalizing languages and ensuring their survival, but above all, to revitalize the speakers, the communities, and ensure their survival. This is why indigenous agency and ownership of these processes is key. Thank you.
Was not planning on saying anything, but really taken by the comments by our professor that languages don't die, that they are being killed. And I think that's a very strong verdict, and one which I think has a lot of legitimacy, and one that I think, coming from an indigenous perspective, aware of that reality. I attended an Indian residential school in Canada. Those schools in Canada were established for the sole purpose of removing children from communities and put them into state supported institutions run by various denominations of religious groups, Catholic or Anglican or others, with the stated purpose to civilize indigenous peoples and to Christianize. So in these schools, one which I attended, we were not, of course, allowed to speak our own language. And in fact, if we did, we were punished for it. So there is that substance behind what you're saying about the killing of languages, not just the dying of languages, but the killing of languages. There is a practical reality here that every state, every single state in reality is a plurilinguistic state, because we all speak languages within the boundaries of a respective state, whether it's Canada or the USA or Mexico or Morocco or China, that there are many languages there. But the reality in these plurilinguistic states is what support goes into the smaller speaking languages of indigenous peoples. The fundamental human rights of indigenous peoples reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ILO Convention 169, the various international instruments, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Rights of the Child to a Language, are all there. The framework is there, but it falls down in practice, as one of the state representatives here said today, that more needs to be done at that level. What is it that needs to be done at that level to ensure the continued survival, to ensure that there is no active or covert practices to kill languages, but to support indigenous languages, indigenous people's languages to be revitalized and to be respected and to be spoken in a proud way by our peoples and maybe many others who wish to learn those languages. I heard on February 1st here that in Uruguay, perhaps it was, that the Guarani was an official language and that over some 80% of the population spoke that language. That was Paraguay, and that was an amazing comment for me to hear that non-indigenous speaking peoples in Paraguay were speaking Guarani, an indigenous language, and it's part of the national language and the national consciousness. What an amazing thing to hear on that particular date. So I just wanted to make those comments to our moderator, is that the recognition that every state is a plurilinguistic state, regardless of whether the constitution or laws of that country recognize that and support every single language, even if there are 2 or 3 speakers left. It is part of that state's legacy. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for reminding us of that. And of course, when you look at the interventions that we have heard, it is not very often that you have a country that has only one language. Of course, there are some, but majority, of course, is with a large number of languages. And if you look around the room, many of us are operating in different languages. Not the languages that we grew up with, but the languages that we had to learn. And even here at the UN, we have 6 official languages that you have the interpretation in, yet there are many others where we do not have any more. I'm going to open up the floor now for I'm just going to take 2 questions. And these must be, I'm sorry to say, I'm not going to take comments. I'm going to take very quick questions to the panelists. And I'm going to be strict about that. And if they have any questions, otherwise we will go back to the panelists for a last round of concluding remarks. So we have just 1-minute questions to the panelists. Is there anybody who wants to raise a question? I have a lady at the back. It is a question to the panelists, ma'am, just to confirm? Yes, okay, you have half a minute.
Hear me? All right. The thing is that with the low developed countries, they have a small budget. They already have budget deficits. So even though there is cultural loss, how can they know that indigenous issues are national concern or they should be addressed? Like why? They have a small budget already, they have budget deficits, we are having cultural loss, then you really have to explain why indigenous issues must be one of the national issues. Like, how would you explain that to people, to countries with small budgets already, national budgets?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because this actually brings to the forefront, why do you need to protect these languages? And I think this is a very good question for the panelists to keep in mind. I have one more spot, and sir, it's a question to the panelists.
General comments on what have you.
You have half a minute, 1 minute, but if you can keep it very specific, and also to ask a question to the panelists, sir.
It's going to be quick. Thank you. Je vous remercie de me donner la parole.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Just a comment on what was said previously, and this morning's exchanges as well. One speaker took the floor earlier to make an erroneous reference to the reality in my country, and I would like to clarify in this respect that the constitution and the current laws in the Kingdom of Morocco apply to all components of Moroccan society without any discrimination. My country's law is perfectly in line with its international commitments and obligations, and I would also like to underscore that the economic and social development efforts being undertaken apply equally to the 12 regions of the kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for bringing this comment and clarification. I think this also flows from the earlier question that was raised, that, how do countries that also have small budgets, how do you do the allocation of resources in such a way that it is distributed and supportive of the different peoples that are in each and every country. Thank you for bringing that point back in again. I'm going to turn now to the panelists to have final concluding remarks, comments, suggestions, whatever. And so we'll start with Luiz, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. With regard to financing, I think that we have to have one principle clear. There is an issue of dignity, and dignity has no price and no limits. So if we're in a multi-ethnic society, this fact must also mark the design and execution of budgets on the one hand. That's the first point. My next point, perhaps this is tangential, but I wanted to point out to you, Chandra, that there's an initiative in Latin America that can be useful to other regions as well. It is the Ibero-American Institute of Indigenous Languages, an initiative to create a supranational body which will encourage the use, preservation, development, and revitalization of indigenous languages. Among other reasons, because a good percentage of languages in Latin America, around 20% approximately, are languages that straddle different national borders. Quechua, for example. Quechua is present in 7 different states, Aymara in 4, Guarani in 4, and so on and so forth. What this calls for, then, are actions that go beyond a single national territory. This is a piece of information which I think is not only characteristic of Latin America, but also is a feature of indigenous reality throughout the world, because the borders of modern states did not take into account ethnic groups. So it's not just national action and financing that is needed, but also the bilateral action and financing in some cases, while in other cases it might be trilateral, quadrilateral, or whatever the number of countries that have a particular linguistic group in them. Thank you.
Thank you. As I conclude, I will want to try and, in one way, that we are doing it in Kenya, because Kenya has the people in this room who have been in the indigenous movement for long know that Kenya has a very active and vibrant indigenous people's movement. And we always bring in a very big delegation of IPs in international meetings, especially during Permanent Forum, MRIP sessions in Geneva, and many others, the CSW and things like that. One, we have learned a culture of threading in indigenous people's issues in major issues. For instance, the country, when it's doing environmental issues or climate change issues, we always put in minority groups to have a voice in every small board or small committee that is there. And we do a self-nominating process at the national level. And so even now we have a climate change council that is chaired by the president, but it has an indigenous person representative. And that person will be able to push in budgets to handle climate change issues for indigenous population. We also use a lot of publicity and advocacy because things are as they are perceived. And we use a lot of media and the politicians to bring in every now and then indigenous people's stories so that they look like they're actually, and they are actually very serious issues. And that way we are able to sell out that indigenous people's issues are a national concern. We also need to make it, in Africa, in my experience in a lot of countries in Africa, things are pushed by money. And if there is no budgetary allocation for it, people will not come. We have public participation for bills in parliament to pass, and people are told there's going to be public participation in such an area. But nobody comes unless they know that there is going to be transport reimbursement or there's going to be tea or something like that. So we need, as the youth leaders of today and even tomorrow, we need to make these issues non-monetary. It should be a community agenda. Like I said earlier, if it is an issue of having Fridays as a cultural day, it doesn't need a budget. It just needs as Sylvia Museya, to tell people that on Friday, can we try, please try, and we put ourselves together, lobby for people to come to such an arena. It is a field day. There's always sun in Africa. It doesn't really rain a lot. So come and enjoy yourselves. So we need to push this thing as a community agenda. And then government will pick us up later when they see that we are actually serious and we're going to move with or without them. And that is, I think, the message that most IPs have to think, that we have had a culture of victimization. We think we are being victimized. And it's true that we are victimized, but we have put it in our mind so much that we are victimized, we are minorities, we are marginalized, we are excluded from the national fabric, economic policies, that we have become almost hopeless. We need to collect ourselves together and push our own agenda in our own space and in our own time. Whoever wants to join us will join us. Because once people see that you're doing something, Friends of Indigenous Peoples will join you. United Nations will join you. Government will join you. Otherwise, they're going to be embarrassed. And finally, I will say that we need to create friendships with non-indigenous people. It is not right that we seem, in my country, for instance, there's a feeling that these indigenous people are feeling so special because we've been able to push so hard that even in parliament, there's a nomination position for indigenous or minority positions. That everywhere, in terms of appointments or nominations to very key, even in cabinet, we must have somebody from minority. So it is only right that we pull in the rest of them and tell them this is an address to historical injustices that has happened for so long. It's going to be an affirmative action. It's going to end at some point. It's not because we are special. It's because we have been left so behind. So please accept and appreciate and help us, pull us up. And once we are at par, we're going to compete fairly. So I think to all the indigenous peoples here and non-indigenous people, we need to carry this as a personal agenda. I carry it as a personal agenda myself. I do not need somebody to come and tell me I'm indigenous. I self-recognize myself. We start from there. And then I don't need you to bring me money for me to pass a bill. I will pass it with or without money because I know I have been through a lot of training, and part of the reason why we do training to youth is so that they can carry out this agenda without so much money, because at the end of the day, we have to leave a legacy behind, and have seen so many people in front of me, including Chandra, who are leaving a legacy in their own space and in their own time. So I have to leave a legacy on my own. I think we have to develop a culture that I have to leave this world a better place without money or monetary appreciation to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the relationship between indigenous peoples and states varies in every country. In some cases, it's worse. In other cases, it's a lot better. However, one thing that I've learned over all the years is complaining doesn't do you any good. What you need to do is develop solutions, come with proposals, come with answers in discussions with governments, in discussions with those who make decisions, in discussions with the corporate world and the public, non-governmental organizations, to let them understand what it is that we are working on, what it is that we're trying to do, and that we do have solutions. We don't want somebody else to develop solutions for us. We know, we live the realities and are capable fully of coming up with the answers that make it better for our communities. And that's a part of that is the decision-making, the recognition of the decision-making responsibilities that we have. The question around the small countries and small budgets, I think it's true everywhere, but relative in size. The Americas, we didn't see anyone until 1492 from some other place in the world, from a European state. And we've had a mass migration from other parts of the world to what we call the Americas now. And the wealth of the land, the resources form the foundation of everybody's way of life. And in a way, when our ancestors welcomed the first explorers, we welcomed them with open arms, as we've been told in our own history, and shared with them what we had. And that's always been in the nature of indigenous peoples globally, whether it's in Africa or whether it's in the Americas or in Asian countries. That's been the pattern. And the United Nations, this house here, is a place for the recognition of human rights. This is a place that advocates for that. The UN, this building, the people that make up this place, this institution's mandate is to help level the playing field, to help respect the human dignity of all peoples. And, you know, when we talk about languages, this family in this house uses 6 different languages to talk to each other through interpreters: the Russian, the French, Spanish, Arabic, English, Chinese, the official languages of this family at the UN. And so we organize ourselves in many different ways, but since the end of the last war, with a focus on fundamental human rights, we're finally, as indigenous peoples, at a place where, as of the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in this House in 2007, we have a framework for indigenous peoples to move forward, including addressing the discriminatory state practice of the past, and to find our place in this house as a part of the part of humanity, a part of the UN family, that we can come into this house and be able to be proud to speak our own language, even though it's not an official language, and be recognized that it is a language of humanity and should be respected as such. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. In the end, actually, I have very short words. to revitalize the indigenous languages. The friendship between the indigenous people and non-indigenous people is important, but there is also one thing we have to consider, that because indigenous language is also a transboundary issue. So when we talk about the indigenous language revitalization, preservation, and development of the indigenous languages, we have to think about the cooperation between the states, because the cooperation between the states also needed to address the issues of indigenous languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists, and also to thank all of you as well for giving us these very concise comments and questions. And I just want to say thank you to you all for giving us such insightful remarks, but also bringing in your own perspectives and your own experiences, so that when we leave this discussion today, in this morning discussion only, we leave with some concrete actions. And I'm just a little bit of some of the comments you have made to pick up on, and I think where you spoke about friendships. Because here, when you look around the room, all of us are from different backgrounds, different agendas, different languages, yet we are all here today. Why? Because, I hope that is the reason why you're here today, is because you believe in the importance of language. You believe in the importance of indigenous peoples' languages. And thank you to Grand Chief for reminding us that there is a little difference between indigenous languages and indigenous peoples' languages, coming from the whole concept of self-identification, as Sylvia pointed out. The other point I liked very much was in terms of which came up and ties in between political will and budgets. Where does the money go? And I think that's where you have to have that link, that if there is commitment, if there is a will, there is a way, we always say. So if there is a commitment, does not need to depend on what the country budget is. And I'm looking around the room, you have countries here with very big budgets, and you have countries with very small budgets, but that does not necessarily equate to what they are doing. And that's a very important factor. Where is the money of the national budget going? Is it going for these factors, social issues, social inclusion, education, health, or is it going to other areas? And that's where you tie in with the political commitment of the country and the member states themselves. The third one I thought was that I liked Sylvia's thing of this culture of victimization. And I come from an indigenous background. I have been working internationally, and of course as an indigenous advocate for many years. And I remember when we were working on the declaration, drafting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I see Grand Chief Ed John, there's Brian, there are others here. One of the comments and questions came from one of our indigenous sisters, and she said, because everywhere it was always indigenous peoples are miserable, indigenous peoples are marginalized, indigenous peoples are excluded, ignored, etc. And one sister got up and said, who amongst you has said that you are miserable? And no one owned up. So it just goes to show that, you have to have a change from this culture, from this perception that we are marginalized, we are excluded. We are not marginalized and excluded to the extent that many of us are here. And there are many others in our countries. Of course, there are others which do face serious marginalization and exclusion. Not to diminish that, but also to recognize that we have to have these advocates, these champions, and thank you very much for that, and to Sylvia for bringing it up, because that's one of the issues that we have to move beyond if we want to go beyond 2030. If you want to see the declaration become a reality, that these are the realities we have to accept, acknowledge, recognize, but go beyond that. with recognition, you have to have action. How are you going to make sure that Guarani, if it's spoken, 80% of the country speaks Guarani, but not necessarily all of them are indigenous? How can this example be used in other countries around the world? I would love to speak many languages. I would love to speak different languages, and I'm sure many of you do, because when you speak someone's language, you see the difference. You speak to somebody in a language, and you speak to them in their language, and you see the immediate reaction. There is this whole warmth that comes with it, and I think that's where they say that when you speak in your own language, you speak from the heart. With that, I just wanted to remind you all that we have a host of other events coming up in the afternoon. We have in the visitors lobby, which is as you come in over there, we have a number of creative initiatives, and we were talking a lot of social media and technology, and here we are showcasing an educational storytelling platform. And then there's also a game which has been devised in Inupiat in Alaska, which is a collaboration of elder storytellers and community members. And this is how we can keep these stories alive for the future. There's also a reality platform from Australia that uses 4D mapping software. So these are just some of the initiatives. We're inviting all of you to go and use these, share these, and I hope that you'll be interested, mobilized, motivated to pick up some indigenous languages and learn how to speak some languages that are not your own and go beyond that. I want to thank all of you for being here with us this morning. We are going to continue, and in the afternoon, we're going to be back here at 3 o'clock. We're going to have a very number of projects that are being championed, and we're going to showcase them, so please do come back at 3 o'clock. You are now free to go and share out these innovations, and the karaoke, don't forget. And I hope we see you all back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you all very much for making your comments insightful, short, brief, and especially to the presenters for sharing so generously of your experiences. Thank you very much.